Now, let's discuss a second example of the voice of our fine shepherd Jesus. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. Jesus said, "You heard that it was said, 'You must not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who keeps on looking at a woman so as to have a passion for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Our fine shepherd is telling us not only to avoid sexual immorality, but also to flee from anything that could lead to it, such as immoral thoughts. And at Matthew 19:9, our fine shepherd tells us, "I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Here Jesus makes clear that the only valid basis for divorce and remarriage in God's eyes is if a disloyal mate commits sexual immorality. But what's the voice of strangers of Satan's world telling us regarding divorce, adultery, and other forms of sexual immorality? No problem. It's your choice. You have the freedom to do what you want. In fact, in order to make sexual immorality appear more innocent, it's often euphemized. Sexual perversion, such as homosexuality, is called an alternative lifestyle. One so-called expert said, "It's simply like being left-handed." Pornography is called adult entertainment. Adulterous betrayal of one's marriage mate is called having an affair. Many call getting married old-fashioned and see nothing wrong with living together without marriage.
We've been watching governing body member Stephen Lett taking us through the September JW Broadcasting episode. Stephen here wants to talk to us about morality. Stephen Lett, governing body member, one of 8 leaders presiding over an organisation that covers up child sexual abuse on an industrial scale and breaks apart families through shunning, leading some to suicide, and persuades his followers to refuse blood transfusions even if it leads to their deaths. This is a man who wants to talk about morals. And I think it's worth just taking a step back and viewing these words in context, because what we've seen in the September broadcast is effectively Stephen Lett setting out the stall of the governing body. He's used very black and white ideology to create this us versus them narrative regarding apostates and the media, and essentially anyone outside his sphere of control or the governing body's sphere of control. He's asking his followers or Jehovah's Witnesses to be distrustful by default of anyone who might be critical of the governing body's authority. But aside from that message, ultimately what is he doing? He is justifying his authority or the governing body's authority. First of all, by referring to the verse in Matthew 24, verse 45 about the faithful and discreet slave, very selectively and stripping the verse of context. And now what he's doing is essentially giving the manifesto of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is all about sex, apparently. That's what makes the governing body or the faithful and discreet slave so special, is that they know what's good and what's bad about sex, and they're interested in policing sex. Whereas others in the world, in Satan's system of things, are less interested or not interested at all in policing sex. This is something that Stephen Lett is proud of. He's proud of the sexual repression in his organization, and he and his colleagues are frankly obsessed with making sure that their followers do sex or don't do sex according to their liking. That's what all of this is about. I've commented before that if you go through the Shepherd book, this is the secret manual for Jehovah's Witness elders that the rank and file members don't get to read. The number of pages allocated for discussing sex rules far outweighs the number of pages for discussing things like physical assault or theft or any of those issues. You're not going to see Stephen Lett talking about how it would be terrible to be violently abusive, or how it would be terrible to commit fraud, or any of those things. What he's doing is narrowing the message down to, well, look at what we say about sex. That's his first thing on the list. Apart from talking about the faithful and discreet slave, that's the first thing he wants us to be thinking about. And I think that alone is extremely telling. If you think about it, it's something that Jehovah's Witnesses have in common with all manifestations of religious fundamentalism, this obsession with sex, as though the creator of the universe, who sits arms folded through the Holocaust, who watches entire families, entire communities be brutalized and destroyed in war after war, including the war in Ukraine, who lets loose pandemics on his creation and watches as the body count climbs. This is a God who says, but what I'm most interested in is sex. Let's forget about all the misery and suffering and let's talk about sex, baby. That seems to be what God's all about. He created humankind to procreate and is especially interested, more interested than ending suffering or holding people accountable for causing suffering. He's especially interested, it seems, in how people use their genitals with consenting sexual partners. That's what he is most interested in, which is a bit perverse, don't you think? And I think it takes a special kind of mindset to be wishing to do the policing on God's behalf, which is what Stephen Lett's talking about here. I hardly know where to begin with all of this, but let's deal with this first quote where Stephen Lett says,
"But what's the voice of strangers of Satan's world telling us regarding divorce, adultery, and other forms of sexual immorality? No problem. It's your choice. You have the freedom to do what you want."
Apparently that's a negative. It's a negative for people to want to do what they want, for people to have autonomy, for people to not have their lives, including their sex lives, micromanaged by clowns like Stephen Lett. He is deriding people who assert their freedom of choice in these matters. He also says,
In fact, in order to make sexual immorality appear more innocent, it's often euphemized. Sexual perversion, such as homosexuality, is called an alternative lifestyle. One so-called expert said, It's simply like being left-handed.
What is it with Stephen Lett and bashing gay people? I mean, the man really has it in for the LGBTQ plus community, doesn't he? He has form here. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, if Tibor is gracious, you will see some thumbnails. There was Stephen Lett's anti-gay convention rant. As I recall, that was at the 2020 convention. Then more recently, at this year's convention, Sushi 333 deals with Stephen Lett aiming a fresh dig at the LGBTQ plus community. As I've covered on this channel, it seems that Stephen Lett is personally connected with this issue because I had the pleasure of interviewing his niece, Brandy Schmiedel, who divulged that Stephen Lett's nephew, her brother, committed suicide as a gay man who was raised in a Jehovah's Witness environment. And it was not long after the death of this man that Stephen Lett gave that first rant at the 2020 convention. So this is a man who should understand what sexual repression does to people and the way it can drive people to the brink, beyond the brink even. And yet he doubles down. He really does insist that he should be able to tell people who they love, who they have sexual relationships with. This is what we're dealing with. And this is quite frankly why so many who are raised in the Jehovah's Witness religion, I feel, get messed up when it comes to sex and sexuality. It leaves its mark on people psychologically. You do not tamper with people's sexuality and tell them who they're allowed to love and whether they're allowed to masturbate or not, and whether they're allowed to be gay or straight. You do not tell them that they're only allowed to explore any kind of relationship so long as it's within a marriage and so long as it's within the members of a certain religious group. You don't do all that without it messing with people on a profound level. We're dealing with a really intimate, deep part of our psyche as humans, aren't we? And that's the area, that's the level at which people like Stephen Lett want to have a say. It's also worth noting that Stephen Lett has pulled the same old trick of citing the unnamed expert. What is it with governing body members attributing quotes to unnamed people so that we can't fact check, we can't verify what's been said and in what context? This coming from someone who has only just been moaning about how apostates leave out details and don't provide information in its proper context. And here he is making a sweeping remark about gay people based on the words of one so-called expert who apparently said that being gay is simply like being left-handed. No name given. And it's based on this sort of sweeping remark that can't be fact-checked that millions of people are supposed to cede control of their sexuality to people like Stephen. And before we move on to the next part, because there's more to say on this whole issue of morality, particularly as it relates to domestic violence, before we move on, I hope you caught what Stephen Lett said about porn.
Pornography is called adult entertainment.
So that's pretty much all Stephen Lett has to say in this lengthy rant on morals regarding pornography. He resents the fact that pornography is called adult entertainment. And just while we're on this point of pornography, I feel it's worthwhile pointing your attention again to the Shepherd the Flock of God book. I've already mentioned that this book has pages and pages and pages about sex and sex rules. It has a whole chapter on pornography. There's the page heading. Don't know whether it's coming up on the camera. Yes, it is. So that's the first page on pornography. You can be disfellowshipped for viewing porn, but it depends what porn. It depends whether it's abhorrent or not. And all of this circles back to essentially homosexuality. Almost as though the rules were written by straight dudes, isn't it? Under the heading, determining whether a judicial hearing is required, it says the deliberate viewing of pornography is a sin. It can result in an addiction to sex, perverted desires, and serious marital problems. However, not all cases require handling by a judicial committee. An entrenched practice of viewing, perhaps over a considerable period of time, abhorrent forms of pornography would be considered gross uncleanness with greediness and needs to be handled judicially. Such abhorrent forms of pornography include homosexuality, brackets, sex between those of the same gender. The paragraph continues. I'm not going to say all of it because I'm mindful of YouTube and monetization and that kind of thing. But let's just skip to that final sentence. It is equally wrong for a man or woman to watch two women engaged in homosexual activity as it is for a man or woman to watch two men engaged in homosexual activity. So it's all about homosexuality. You can watch straight porn and you'll just be given a slapped wrist. But if it's gay porn, it's a sin. Well, all porn is apparently a sin, but if it's gay porn, you can be disfellowshipped and estranged from your family. So that's how arbitrary this stuff is. Stephen Lett can skirt over porn and complain about it being called adult entertainment if he wants, but I'm going to drag him back to what he's actually written, or his organisation has actually written on this. And in my opinion, it's a double standard. And it's manifestly a bunch of arbitrary rules written by a particular demographic, written by straight people who, for whatever reason, feel threatened by the existence of gay people.
This world's media is very skillful at presenting something bad as good. For example, in a movie, a female character might be portrayed as having a husband who is abusive. You like the woman, and you want her to find happiness. Then a handsome man starts working in her office, and he's so nice to her. There's an attraction between them, and the budding romance is presented as something good. Soft background music makes it hard to consider her course to be bad. It's easy to keep watching and hope she leaves her marriage mate and runs off with her workmate. And usually that's what happens. So easily we can forget that Jehovah and Jesus hate adultery and unscriptural divorce. But when we reject the voice of this world and listen to the voice of Jehovah and Jesus, we bring protection and blessings to ourselves and others.
So now we're talking about domestic violence. And just as a recap, this is a man, Stephen Lett, who fancies himself as an expert on morality. He claims to be a governing body member, an anointed governing body member, handpicked by God, no less. And he claims to be part of God's channel with mankind. And he claims that his morals, or the morals of his organization, uniquely qualify his organization to tell people how to run their lives. And yet, what is he advocating when it comes to domestic violence by means of this illustration? I found it quite telling when he talked about soft background music.
Soft background music makes it hard to consider her course to be bad.
So her course is apparently bad. We'll get to that later. But I love the fact that a man who is on the teaching committee of the governing body, a man who on a day-to-day basis involves himself in the video propaganda that gets churned out by this organization, is lamenting the way soft background music can be used to make a negative message a positive message. He's lamenting the way music can be used to manipulate people. As someone who uses music in precisely this way, you don't need me to show you examples. If you watch enough Jehovah's Witness propaganda, the sort that gets reviewed on this channel, you'll be able to call to mind example after example of where they play soft background music to make you more emotionally engaged in what's being said, to make what's being said sound more appealing. And he apparently can't stand the way other people do this, but it's apparently fine for his organization to do it. It's apparently fine for him to do it. It's utter hypocrisy. But that aside, let's recall what he's talking about in this illustration. He's talking about a movie with a female character who is portrayed as having a husband who is abusive.
For example, in a movie, a female character might be portrayed as having a husband who is abusive.
A husband who is abusive. So there's no ambiguity here. It's not the husband might be abusive or they're having marital problems. It's a definitive statement. The husband is abusive. If someone's in an abusive relationship, they should get out of it, shouldn't they? But the whole point of Stephen Lett's illustration is that she shouldn't get out of that abusive relationship. She shouldn't get a divorce from her abusive husband if the abusive husband hasn't cheated on her. It would be wrong for her to pursue a relationship with someone else if she doesn't have a divorce from her husband. It would be, you might even say, more wrong for her to move on with her life and find someone new than the abuse that she was suffering. That seems to be the message here. I don't think I'm exaggerating. And what we have here is almost a drive-by of the governing body's disgusting policy when it comes to domestic violence. I've done a video before on this, on the January 2018 Watchtower article, thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious. Let's actually read 2 paragraphs from that article, just in case you're watching this as someone who doesn't know much about Jehovah's Witnesses and thinks I might be exaggerating, or maybe you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses and you just haven't thought this through yet. And I'm going to be honest, that was kind of where my head was at when I was first waking up to the fact that this isn't the truth. So December 2018 Watchtower. Let's look at page 14, paragraphs 17 and 18. Admittedly, there have been instances where an unbelieving husband seems to prove that he is not agreeable to staying with her. He might be extremely physically abusive, even to the point that she feels that her health or life is in danger. He might refuse to support her and the family or severely endanger her spirituality. In such cases, some Christians have personally decided that despite what he might say, the mate is not agreeable to staying together and that a separation is necessary. But other Christians in comparably difficult situations have not. They have endured and tried to work at improving matters. Why? So apparently, an extremely physically abusive marriage mate should be endured in some situations, even if they are endangering their spouse's health or life. Let's read on. Paragraph 18. In such a separation, the two are still marriage mates. If they lived apart, each one would face challenges, as mentioned earlier. The Apostle Paul gave another reason for staying united. He wrote, "The unbelieving husband is sanctified in relation to his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified in relation to the brother. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy." Many loyal Christians have remained with an unbelieving mate under very trying circumstances. They can testify that doing so was worthwhile in a special sense when their mate became a true worshipper. So what this is really saying, if you read between the lines, is if you are with an unbelieving husband, if you're a Jehovah's Witness woman with an unbelieving husband who is extremely physically abusive, who is endangering your health and life, it might be worthwhile staying with them so that they can become a true worshipper. Apparently, the most important thing here is that there's an opportunity for someone to become a Jehovah's Witness. Never mind that life is in the balance, that there could be a death, that someone is endangering someone's life. The main thing is that Jehovah's Witnesses benefit in some way by adding to their numbers. And this is an organization that wants to lecture us on morals.